Okay, so again, welcome everyone. My name is Katie Nguyen. I'm the Communications and Public Programs Director here at the museum. I'm delighted that you're joining us today. I think probably quite a few of you have been on these talks before, but just a reminder to keep yourself muted. You're welcome to turn on your camera, but if you just want to hold the sound, keep that off till the end of the talk. That would be great. I'm joined by WEM curator Emily Zilber. She's here as well. So she'll be monitoring the chat, which, as we often do in these talks, you can put questions as we go through the talk in the chat if you like. Or if you prefer, we'll leave a little time at the end to sort of have a conversation, answer any questions that we didn't get to, all that good stuff. So before we dive into the topic of the talk today, I'm just going to share my screen. And I just want to update you about a few programs that we have coming up. So let me get this screen share going. Okay, so here's our spotlight talk, the Holzhausen curtains. Everybody can see that, yeah? Great. So of course, if you haven't heard about it already, there's a wonderful exhibit at the Michener Museum of Art in Doylestown, open now through February 6th, called Daring Design, the Impact of Three Women on Wharton Esherick's Craft. And this was sort of the inspiration for what we are talking about today. The exhibit focuses on Hanna Weil, who we're chatting about today, Helene Fisher, and Marjorie Content, who we did a spotlight talk on last month. So if you haven't seen the exhibit, definitely go. I haven't been myself yet, but I'll be heading up there in the next week or so. And in the exhibit, you can see works by furniture by Esherick, as well as some works by Marjorie and Hannah, who are both artists themselves. So a lot of great stuff to see there. They've got some great programming coming up. So there's a Women in Craft panel discussion on November 11th. Emily is actually going to be the moderator for that. And she'll be speaking with Miriam Carpenter, Mira Nakashima, and Jennifer Nava-Milliken. So that should be a fantastic conversation. They'll also be hosting a gallery talk with Mark Spheri in early December, which I'm sure that's a familiar name for many people in our community. He's a woodworker, and he is also the co-curator of the Daring Design exhibit, along with the Michener's chief curator, Laura Turner-Igo. So you'll want to keep your eye out for those programs. And then here at WEM, we've got our last of the Creative Passport benefit series coming up. That's actually an on-site program. So if you are ready to get off the computer and get back to the studio, that's a great way to do it. We're having a lot of fun with people, getting some creative juices flowing with sketching and spoon carving, all kinds of good stuff. So you can check that out on our website. We also have some programs coming up with Craft Now. Emily will be hosting or part of the symposium in Craft Now in early November, and Creatives on Esherick, our next talk will be featuring Roberta Massich, who has been our artist in residence over the past year and whose work is currently on exhibit in the studio. So let's get moving, right? The Holzhausen curtains, some of you perhaps have seen them, or it might look familiar if you've been up in Esherick's studio bedroom. These are a set, or really a test set of curtains that Esherick made for Hanna Weil. She was a German artist and a friend of Esherick's. And it's an unusual piece in that we don't have a lot of textile works from Esherick, or pieces where he's experimenting on textiles. On the textile, I should say, he's repeating this whole Holzhausen print. And you can see that repetition there. You've got the image kind of staggered, almost like a brick wall, sort of, to fill out that textile. The final ones were actually a gift for Hannah, and they were printed on blue linen. So these are very much a sort of test run for Esherick. And in a moment, I will show a close-up of the print, but I figured let's introduce Hannah before we go any further. Okay, so here's Hanna. Hanna Weil and Wharton Esherick met by way of a woman, Helene Fisher, who is also featured in the Daring Design exhibition. She was a businesswoman and a really important patron for Esherick. She had seen Hanna's work in Germany and was really taken with it, and so became an important patron for her as well. She, in fact, sort of funded that her own son, York Fisher, would go and study with Hanna. He was also interested in art, and then eventually funded Hanna to come and visit the United States, and that's where she had the opportunity to meet Esherick, and then helped Esherick travel back over to Germany to spend some more time with her. So there was a lot to be said for Helene Fisher's sponsorship of these relationships and these opportunities. Hanna was a sculptor herself, and she was mainly celebrated for her ivory carving and some metal work that she was doing. I'll show a couple pieces in a moment. And here she's sitting at this beautiful work table that was made for her by Esherick and York Fisher. He was also on the trip in 1931. And you can see these wonderful carvings, this sort of radiating pattern along the bottom there. And here we have a couple more pictures of Hanna. I was excited to find these in our archives just this past week preparing for this talk. These are photos taken on the front porch of her home. I don't know who this gentleman playing the accordion is, but the other two photos, you see Esherick there with Hanna. In one of them, they're sketching, and you can imagine they're looking out into the view that is actually the print that Holzhausen is inspired by. And then down below, you can see them working. It looks like Esherick has a file in his hand, some other woodworking tools. So they're working on something together down below there. They definitely had a great affinity for each other as two carvers. And I think you can see in these slides of Hanna's work that she's clearly very inspired by the natural world, which is a really similar, aspect to Esherick, although he interpreted it certainly in a different way. But an incredible carver. I mean, she was really very skilled at what she was doing. Esherick would, and I believe these two pieces are in the show that's at the Daring Design exhibit, so you can see some of her work there. Esherick, when he had the opportunity, would show her work with his in the 1940 World's Fair in New York. So at that time, he had the chance to primarily show an exhibit of his furnishings. And within that, to sort of fill out the room display, there were some books from the Centaur Press and sort of pieces from other friendships. June Groff is seen in there. And there was ivory utensils by Hanna Weil. So he was excited to have the opportunity to kind of support her in that way when he had the opportunity. I'll mention also, because there's not a lot of places to learn about Hanna's work. She's not somebody who's in all of the history books or anything like that. But Mark Spheri is going to be doing a talk at the Glencairn Museum in early December. And he's going to be talking specifically about Hanna's work, and in particular, a nativity scene that she made. She was commissioned by the Pitcairn family, whose home is now the Glencairn Museum, to create this nativity scene for the Eisenhower family. And so it was owned by the president and his family. It was in the White House on display for their holidays. And so a really interesting kind of unexpected tangent to her life story. So you should definitely check out that program as well. Okay, so coming back to the print, here you have the individual print of the Holzhausen cut. If you're thinking of those photographs we just saw with Hanna and Wharton out on the porch, this is the view that they were looking at least Esherick's interpretation of it. And so you're seeing these wonderful angles in the landscape. You've got a figure up front, this pair of oxen pulling the cart in from the right side. Off in the distance is a lake, Ammersee, possibly. Ammersee Lake was nearby. and a ship, a church in the distance. And then if you can make it out, there's also a little train kind of cutting across the landscape there. So it's a pretty active little scene for this town. And it also provides, I think, an interesting or sort of charming aspect to why the curtains are so interesting. When Esherick made them, it was sort of a playful way for him to say, okay, Hanna, now when you close your curtains, you're still going to have the view that you have when they're open, in his interpretive way. It's interesting too, and this next slide I'll show how Esherick is sort of breaking those portions of the landscape into angles and patterns, and how it sort of mimics what he was thinking about when he was making three-dimensional works at that time. So the print, which is from 1932, comes just after the Fisher corner desk, which I'm showing on the left. And that was a piece that was actually commissioned by Helene Fisher. You can see these sort of strong angles happening inside, on the outside. Inside, it's doing lots of the same thing, very strong angular expressionist forms. And on the right is a table lamp from the same year as the print, where we're seeing those angular forms again. In this case, the light bulb is sort of nested in the bottom of those four tall spires. So you're seeing some really dramatic use of angles there. Also from this period is this wonderful light pole, the little figurative light pole that's in the studio now. It's one that I think many guests enjoy when they are at the studio. And it was actually a gift to Hanna Weil. So Esherick made this for her when he headed off for the trip. And in exchange, she gave him this really ornately carved ivory cigarette holder, which was fascinating to me because, one, I didn't realize at the time that Esherick was a smoker. And also, I wish that we could see, I wish we had a photograph of that cigarette holder so we could have seen what that looked like. I was told by Esherick's son-in-law, Bob Baskin, before he passed away, that after Esherick passed, the families decided to exchange the gifts back. And so that's why we have this back in the studio today. But really charming, wonderful example of another gift that they exchanged together. And there are plenty more. In fact, I'll just plug their catalog really quickly. If you are heading up to the show, definitely take a look at the show catalog. There's lots more information that I'm sharing today about Hanna and the other women in here. And there's a wonderful gift, another gift that Esherick made for Hanna, which is a spoon. And he carves into it for Hanna to brew a stew for Wharton. So you can tell the sort of the closeness that they had and the sort of playful affection of that relationship there. So I was just showing some examples of where the expressionism that is apparent in the print is clearly happening in other aspects of what Esherick is making at the time. But in a way, it would be too tidy to say that that's all that the type of art that was being produced by Esherick. Sometimes things were less expressionist in a sort of obvious sense. And so I thought I would show this woodcut fjord, which is also inspired by scenes from his trip to Europe. It's an unusual print for him in how open it is, and it doesn't have as much sort of intensity of line work happening. It's really an open kind of scene of these two people in a rowboat on a fjord in Norway, presumably. And then on the right, you can see where Esherick has done that sketch, quite possibly, seeing that in person and jotting that down on his travels, and then interpreting that into the print when he's back at his studio in Paoli. We actually have an enormous amount of sketches by Esherick at the studio, which I love to look over. I think it's a really interesting part of his artistic development. And so here I'm showing a photograph of Esherick sketching, and then a few pages from these wonderful travel sketchbooks that we have. We have maybe 7 or 8 travel sketchbooks within the larger sketch collections, which is thousands and thousands of loose pages and everything else. And about 5 of them are from this trip in 1931, where he traveled to Stockholm, he was in Hamburg, he was in Oslo, Copenhagen, and of course, Bavaria and Holzhausen, where Hanna was living. And he was sketching everything. So sometimes it was, parts of the ship that he was on, the steamship that he was using to travel across the Atlantic, even sketching it on their letterhead. And other times it was historic buildings, lots of landscapes. There were figures, scenes of what was for breakfast. Everything was up for grabs as far as sketching. In fact, I always liked how former director Paul Eisenhower put it, that Esherick used a sketchbook the way some people used a camera. These sketches are ones from Holzhausen, so they're sort of all gathered together in the Holzhausen sketchbook. I love this one up on the top left and the expression on the ox. Very easygoing looking day for him. And I imagine they're piling hay or something on the back in the farmland. So not a direct, compositionally a direct relationship to Holzhausen, but certainly the content and the different things he was sketching there kind of made their way into that final print. And then also here you're seeing lots of sketches of Hanna's home. So on the left is one that he does with some watercolor, which is interesting. There weren't many of those. In the center, there's one where you can see if you can make out there's a stovepipe, a sort of stove in the center of the room, a chair behind it, and maybe an instrument on the wall. Her house is to the right there, and that would be the porch that there seem to be doing a lot of activity on. And if you could turn around from that drawing, you'd be looking back at Holzhausen again, the print. And then I'm speculating, but I imagine that the bottom right could likely be drawings of Hanna as she's working. You can see someone has a rasp and is working on the sculpture there. And then I also just wanted to share before we wrap up, there are wonderful collections of postcards in Esherick's archives as well. And they provide a really interesting insight into both through his notes on the back as well as what he was selecting, where he had gone and the things that really sparked his curiosity. So this one on the left is from the Norsk Folk Museum in Oslo. And the museum itself is sort of dedicated to the folk culture of Norwegians from 1500 to now, as far as I understand it. But a lot of what they have is these historic wooden buildings with these incredibly ornate carved folk carvings. And so Esherick on the back of this postcard to his son Peter says, "Something beautiful from Norway, beautiful bed, grand tables, and wooden dishes and tankards." And then on the right, there is a sculpture by Carl Elde called Dansen, or The Dance. And this is actually a sculpture that I also noticed he photographed himself many, many times. So he was very excited about this one, it seems. And on the back of this card, he writes to Mary, "A good example of a piece of sculpture where the figure lightly touches the earth, gently moving. Love, Wharton." So he was certainly picking up inspiration all throughout this trip that he was on. And then the very last slide here, I just wanted to mention that in our visitor center right now is an exhibit called Stories from the Archives. And one of the pieces on display is Wharton's passport, which he needed, of course, to head overseas. And so it's just another wonderful touch point to all of the stories sort of held within this trip. And if you enjoy archives, if you like kind of looking through those personal notes and those postcards, Emily has put together a wonderful little display in our visitor center of some really nice connections through these new archives we've found. So with that, thank you for joining us. And if you have any questions or comments or things to share, we would love to hear them. I will stop sharing my screen. You can put them in the chat. You're also welcome to just chime in if you like.
I just want to say thank you to the staff for the tender, loving care of the collection and all this research and sharing it with us. It just really fleshes out even more Esherick's life story. So thank you for that.
Yeah, absolutely, Rob. Thank you for the comment. It's fun. I mean, I think Emily would agree that, and you know, as the former director, sometimes there's so many other directions to be pulled in. And these talks and programs, it's a nice excuse to go digging through things and say, what can we find about a certain topic? So it's a lot of fun.
And the story just gets richer, it seems.
Yes, absolutely.
So
I'll
thank
mention
you.
also, since it doesn't seem like anyone else has any questions, we actually decided to print Holzhausen on tea towels, and it's going to be part of a membership level gift. So it's coming back.
All right.
In a form that is not tattered and that you could have in your own kitchen. So that's exciting for us too. I'm not quite sure how we're going to roll it out, but that's a little sneak preview there. Well, thank you all so much for joining. Like I said, we had a lot of fun putting it together. We're always grateful to have you at these programs. Stay tuned for the next one. We'll be sending a follow-up email with lots of links as we always do. So wonderful.
Thank you. Bravo.
Thank you very much.